I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a whole range of issues, political issues, social issues. From the election of Tom Perez as the new DNC chair, as well as the defeat of Congressman Keith Ellison, to the presidency of Donald Trump. And on this edition of In the News, I'm so pleased to be joined by a man for whom I have the highest regard and affection, and an individual who's been tireless in his efforts to enhance and sustain American Jewish life and the well-being of the State of Israel. Alan Solow, past chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations and past chair of the JCCA, the Jewish Community Centers Association. Currently, Alan is chairman of Interfaith Youth Corps, a national organization promoting interfaith dialogue and service projects on college campuses. And as many of you may know, Alan Solow is a close personal friend of former President Barack Obama and was a Jewish voice in the White House during Mr. Obama's 8 years in office. Alan, it is wonderful having you back on JBS. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
So Alan, let's begin with the most sensitive issue relating to President Obama. As he left office, he chose to have the United States abstain on UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which defined all Jewish communities to the east of Israel's border to be illegal and a flagrant violation of Israeli law. And this includes the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, the Old City of Jerusalem, the Western Wall, and of course the Jewish suburbs of Jerusalem. Do you have any idea, why do you think the president took this action as he left office?
Well, let me answer the question, Mark, with 2 points. First of all, I believe that Secretary Kerry clarified in his speech subsequent to the vote having been cast that America does, in many respects, view the issue of Jerusalem and what are generally referred to as the settlement blocks differently than it regards other territories that are considered either in Territory A, B, or C in the Palestinian territories. There is a distinction between those, I think, in the minds of the last administration, and I think historically on the part of all administrations. So I think we ought to make that clear. The problem, however, for any administration casting a vote on a UN resolution of the sort that was proposed is that it is the Israeli government itself that doesn't distinguish between the so-called settlement blocks and the issues of Jerusalem and the outlying and sometimes even under Israeli law, illegal outposts that are considerably to the east and take up much of Area C. So if you look at what the position of the Israeli cabinet and security leadership and Knesset political leadership has been, they have refused to make a distinction between any of the Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, and that poses a challenge to the American foreign policy team that has to decide what to do about voting on the UN resolution. So I would just say, as point number one, this notion that it's the Americans who chose not to make the distinction is a little bit misleading in the sense that the Israeli government takes the same position as well. Now, having said that, I think that the reason that President Obama decided to abstain was that he believed that it was very important from the perspective of American foreign policy and as Israel's best friend in the world to send an important message to Israel and its people that the future for Zionism and for the Jewish people does not lie in an ongoing, unending occupation of what are designated the Palestinian territories under the Oslo Agreement, and that, as Secretary Kerry made clear in his subsequent speech, an agreement which would include swaps based on the 1967 lines is the future for a secure Jewish democratic Israel. And in the absence of the ultimate creation of a Palestinian state and the separation of the Israeli population from the population of the Palestinian state, the State of Israel will cease to be either Jewish on the one hand or democratic on the other, neither one of which is consistent with long-standing American policy.
Okay. My asking you this question is not because I wanted to debate the issue of two-state solution, one state, how do you make peace with the Palestinians? And everyone who's watching JBS should understand without any question, Alan Solow is committed to the State of Israel. And remember, he was the past chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the umbrella organization of American Jewry. His job was to represent us and represent, in essence, the leadership of the Jewish community here in America on issues relating to Israel, on issues relating to any other Jewish community outside the United States. And as I said, here's a guy who has been the head of the Jewish Center Community Relations, in essence, JCCs all across America. There is no one more committed to Jewish life than Alan Solow. And at the same time, I'm worried, Alan, that you received a lot of flack because of your close association with Barack Obama. And there were many in the Jewish community who just saw whatever is deeper than red. They saw deeper than red over this resolution. And what bothered them was it was clear that the president had a different philosophy about settlements than certainly the prime minister and the current Israeli government. But Israel, the United States normally would not abstain on an anti-Israel resolution in the UN Security Council, and that's what the president chose to do. So he took, as you know, enormous flack in the Jewish community for doing that. And I said to myself, I wonder, because of your close association with him, did you deal with all kind of criticism, and you know, have you fared okay through that entire flap?
Well, look, if you're going to be involved in public life and you're going to be involved in Jewish American politics, it is very unlikely that if you are active that you're going to avoid flack entirely.
Yes.
Our community has agreement over many basic issues, but the devil is always in the details.
Yes.
And there is always disagreement with respect to implementation. So I'm a long-time Israel-loving Zionist. I make no bones about that. But among those who have that belief, there are many positions that we share, and there are some positions on which we disagree.
Yes.
It's easy to avoid disagreement if you don't have any deeply held beliefs. It's hard to avoid disagreement if you do.
Yes.
So I'm comfortable in trying to take what I think are principled positions that support a strong, secure, safe, thriving Israel, and I'm prepared to engage intellectually, as I did during my time as a member of the Conference of Presidents, and then as the chair of the Conference of Presidents, and subsequent to my chairmanship as a past chair of the Conference of Presidents. I am comfortable engaging with people who have a different point of view as to how we get to that safe, secure, thriving Jewish state in our homeland.
Yes.
That's all fair game, and if you don't enjoy the intellectual combat which occurs from time to time, you should get out of the game.
Yes.
I just want to add one other thing in response kind of to the preamble to your question. This is the only time that President Obama abstained on a resolution relating to Israel, and he's not the only president who's ever done that. My goodness, we should remember that during the Gaza war, when President Bush was going out of office in 2009, he abstained on a resolution which many people viewed as being critical of Israel over its conduct during that Gaza conflict, and he was criticized for that. So I just want to say that President Obama's action was not singular in the sense that it was unique among all American presidents. This happens from time to time where even presidents who are generally very, very supportive of Israel and of a strong relationship between the United States and Israel, and I would put President Obama strongly in that category, even sometimes they have disagreements that rise to the level of causing some public disagreement. And this final UN resolution was such an instance.
Yes. But I want to say to you how very much it means to me the stand you take on the issue of dialogue. And as long as I've known you, I have seen how you are ready to discuss any question that's confronting the Jewish community in or outside the United States with anybody who disagrees with you. And it was one of the reasons why it made you an exceptional chairman of the President's Conference, and everybody should understand that you are a model in many ways. It's not about whether people agree with you or not. Anybody watching JBS has the right to agree with you or disagree with you. But we shouldn't be afraid of the discussion, Alan. And I want you to speak about that for one moment. I am so personally upset, worried, and offended by the way in which both the right and the left, and today, Alan, because I've grown up this liberal Jewish kid, it always bothers me if I feel the mistake is being made on the liberal side. At the moment, there are people who refuse to talk to Republicans. If you support Donald Trump, you are the devil. And we spoke with Ron Campius earlier this week. Ron described how at the JCPA there were people who stood up and say you cannot invite a member of the Trump administration to even speak to us. There's a cancerous resistance here to dialogue with people. You represent the very opposite, and I wonder whether it bothers you the same way it bothers me.
Yeah, well, I don't like to stand in judgment of other people, but my particular point of view is that the failure to engage in dialogue and to listen to people who disagree with you is fundamentally un-Jewish.
Yes.
Our entire tradition is based on the notion that we start from a point that perhaps we agree on, and then we digress to a conversation about what we disagree on, and we try through that disagreement to obtain something that is closer to the truth. Sometimes that results in an agreement, and sometimes it doesn't. But the entire tradition, particularly reflected in the Talmud, is based upon the notion that we can be together in many respects and disagree on other issues, and that disagreement is the way we learn from one another. So, look, there are some people who I think take positions that are out of bounds from my perspective, that I would not engage in conversation with. People who don't believe, for instance, in the right of the Jewish people to live in their homeland, who fundamentally reject that as being an acceptable principle. Would I engage in a dialogue with them? I suppose I would listen to them, but I wouldn't have the same type of serious dialogue with them than I would with somebody who accepts that basic premise, but who has a strong disagreement with me about what the borders should be.
I understand.
Of the state of Israel.
I understand. And that's also a very valid point. Okay, anyway, I'll say it again. You're a model, Alan, and I appreciate you enormously. Alan, so how did you feel about the flap over the DNC's election of a new chair? There were many in the Jewish community who were very upset that there was so much support for Keith Ellison. They were glad that Thomas Perez has been elected chair. But again, there were many in the Jewish community who couldn't understand why anybody should be against Keith Ellison, and included many very respected Jewish leaders. I want to know how you felt about it, and as you see the issue resolve with Perez's victory and Ellison becoming deputy chair, you, as somebody who is within the Democratic Party at a certain level, how did you feel about it in general as you watched this whole thing play out?
Well, I think that in large part the whole battle over the election of the next DNC chair was a little bit overblown, because at the moment, since Democrats do not hold the presidency, are not in the majority in the House of Representatives, are not in the majority in the United States Senate, they are substantially behind in terms of the number of governorships that they hold and the number of state legislatures that they control. There's not a lot of things for Democrats to pay attention to. and therefore there was a spotlight on the election of the chair of the Democratic National Committee, which was probably unheralded in the history of American political parties.
Yes.
So I think that the focus on that election and what that job means was overblown. And people had nothing better to argue about, so they looked at that.
Very interesting.
Look, Representative Ellison has what I think people could characterize as a bit of a mixed record when it comes to his views on Israel and his relationship with the Jewish people. He acknowledged himself that he said some things earlier on in his life that he regrets having said. And it's up to every individual to assess whether or not that apology and regret is sincere or not. As for myself, it appears to me to be sincere, and I have no ongoing gripe with what Congressman Ellison has said. However, it is. Would I have preferred that he never had said those things to begin with? Of course, I would have preferred that. I think he would have preferred it as well. I would just point out that he has had what, by all accounts, an excellent relationship with a very vibrant and dynamic Minneapolis-St. Paul Jewish community. I know many folks in that community who think very highly of him and who are very active in Jewish communal life in the Minneapolis area, and I put a lot of stock in what their views are on the character and the beliefs and the behavior of Congressman Ellison. Tom Perez is a longtime public servant, civil liberties activist. I think will be an outstanding chair of the Democratic Party, and in the end, what will matter for Democrats and for the country is how they behave going forward.
Yes. I have to ask you, though, what your reaction is to the fact that Keith Ellison voted against the Iron Dome, which was a much more important issue, for example, to Alan Dershowitz, who, you saw what he wrote. He was struggling with whether he can stay in the Democratic Party if the party decided that of all the candidates who were qualified to be DNC chair, that you had to pick somebody who not only was involved with Farrakhan, and Ellison has said he repudiates that, but he did vote against the Iron Dome, and for Dershowitz, he couldn't see past that. Did Ellison's vote on the Iron Dome have any effect on you?
Well, again, it's a vote that I would have preferred he had not made. Do I think that characterizes his entire public record and on balance leads me to the conclusion that he's anti-Israel? No, it doesn't lead me to that conclusion. I think that picking out a particular vote requires you to look at a broader range of votes that any individual has taken and make your assessment. I understand what Professor Dershowitz's assessment was. I'm not going to comment on how he came to his conclusion. My conclusion is based largely on what Congressman Ellison's Jewish constituents and the Jewish leadership in Minneapolis seems to have said about him. In the end, again, I don't think that Congressman Ellison's support for this job had anything to do with the votes that he took on the issues that you've identified. It had to do with lots of other factors. I think largely Secretary Perez had the same situation. I don't think this vote was very much about what their views were on Israel. We tend always to think that it's all about us, which is okay to some extent, but I think this was largely not about us. No. And I think going forward, this will be not about us at all.
By the way, we mentioned Dershowitz. His main concern at the moment is that he does not want to see the Democratic Party hijacked by the far left, which has said things and taken positions which seem to be anti-Israel. Are you, as somebody who's intimate with the Democratic Party, worried about a far left shift in the Democratic Party that would be in some way to Israel's disadvantage?
I'm always aware of the possibilities of those who would challenge policies that I believe in, particularly as they regard the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I wouldn't say that I have zero level of concern, but I'm not worried about the way that particular discussion is going to turn out. I believe that Democrats, since the day that Israel declared itself a state under the leadership of President Harry Truman, a strong Democrat, have always been at the forefront of the pro-Israel movement in the United States, and as a party will continue to be in that position.
Okay. So, Alan, much of your early work in the Jewish community was with the National Association of Jewish Centers. And recently we've seen that there have been numerous bomb threats against JCCs. From your perspective, and you were there for many years, how serious do you take these bomb threats and this apparent uptick in anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it has to be taken extremely seriously. We don't know exactly why it's happening, and I'm not going to attribute motives to anybody at this point, because to do so would be merely guesswork. But the fact that I think there's now been over 100 bomb threats phoned into JCCs, and we've seen damage in cemeteries, and we've seen other Jewish institutions, including the ADL, receive bomb threats, is frightening to the people who are in those buildings and is disruptive to a normal Jewish American life in the United States. When you have hundreds of children in a preschool in the middle of winter and buildings have to be evacuated, and you have to keep not only 3 and 4 and 5 and 6-year-old children calm, but perhaps equally importantly, you have to keep the parents of those children calm in the face of these threats. The challenge is immense, and we don't want to let those who are spreading this type of vile behavior prevail by having people take their children out of school and make them give up on the option of having their children educated in a Jewish school because they don't want their children to face these threats. We need to push back against this. And I know that the Jewish Community Centers Association and the ADL and other organizations have been working very hard with political leadership in this country, with the Department of Justice, with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, with their local police authorities to try to get to the bottom of this and put an end to it.
Yes. So, Alan, was Donald Trump's statement against anti-Semitism satisfactory to you?
Well, I'd say in the first instance it was late for me. And I think that what would be the best thing for our country and for President Trump at this point to do is to not merely make an occasional statement that condemns anti-Semitism and speaks out against these threats. And I believe that this morning the press secretary, again on behalf of the president, made a statement to that effect. But I think what needs to be done right now by the administration is that they have to make it clear through action that they are devoting resources at the federal government level and that they are cooperating with state law enforcement authorities to find out who is making these threats and to bring those people to justice.
By the way, when you were chairman of the JCCA, did you have bomb threats at any point?
Actually, we had one in Chicago, or a series at one particular center in Chicago, and it turned out to have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But I learned how it impacted on parents, and I learned how it impacted on the participants in our programs. In this particular instance, where it seems very clear that the motivation is anti-Semitic, and it's not being done for any reason other than that, I think that the potential to do damage to American Jewry is very significant, and it's not just happening in one place. It's obviously happening all over the country. This is something that we have not seen as Jews in this country in a very, very long time. It reminds us of behaviors which my grandparents left countries in Europe in order to escape, and we don't want to see that in the United States. It's not who we are, and therefore we need to pull together as a country and make clear that this type of behavior is unacceptable, and we will leave no stone unturned until the perpetrators of these criminal acts are found and brought to justice.
You know, I think you say it so beautifully, and you'll forgive me. The only wrinkle is that I don't believe these were the reasons why your grandparents or any parents left Eastern Europe or left Germany. It wasn't because there were calls and threats. It was because there was a change in the way in which institutionalized anti-Semitism was either condoned or actually practiced. So while I'm upset that there are these bomb threats and the desecrations in a St. Louis cemetery or a Philadelphia cemetery, I don't see this as anything comparative to what was basically the precursor to the Holocaust.
Well, I would just comment in this way. If you look at the pogroms, and there are a number of different, historical interpretations of what happened, but certainly one fair conclusion is that local Jew hatred was allowed to run wild, and the institutions that could have stopped it either supported it or were simply benign about it and let it happen. Now, what I don't want to happen in America is for us to go towards the path of being benign about this as a society or as a government.
Yes, absolutely.
That's why it's important that the president did stop avoiding the subject, and it was important in a good way that he did speak out, and it will be even more important when he makes it clear that the institutions of our society, such as the FBI, are going to act in full force against these people who are making these bomb threats and desecrating cemeteries and taking other similar actions. That is what will distinguish what's happening in the year 2017 from what happened 100 years ago, and 120 years ago, and 140 years ago. I agree with you that we're not to that point. I'm not suggesting that America is what the Pale of Settlement was like when my grandparents fled to come here, but what I am saying is that it is an echo. What is happening today is an echo, and because we don't want to replicate what happened to us before, we need to stand strong now and cut it off now. And therefore, our country, across the board, from left to right, regardless of religion, regardless of what political party you belong to, has to stand together against this type of abhorrent conduct.
Alan Solow, I love you so much, and I am always so thrilled to be able to present you on JBS. I feel you have a singular voice, and you stand for something very, very important within both the liberal community, the Democratic community, and the Jewish community. And I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for your friendship, my friend. I will call you often. Be well.
Always fun to be on with you, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, my friend. Be well. The thoughts of Alan Solow, past chairman of the President's Conference and the current chair of Interfaith Youth Corps. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.